Welcome to the Get Published podcast, sponsored by Brodie Consulting Group. To get more information about our coaching, publishing, executive ghostwriting, and podcast production services, go to getpublishedpodcast.com. Hello, I am Paul Brodie, and thank you for joining us for another episode of the Get Published podcast, where we help authors get published with a proven system that works. And today, we're being joined by Asger Folmann, author of Spiritual Capitalism. Asger, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Paul.
Well, we are thrilled to have you. Are you ready to begin?
Yes, I am.
All right. Question number one. What is the one piece of advice that you would give to a first-time author who is currently writing their book?
I mean, I want to say more than one thing, but it depends on your personality first and foremost, but I want to say self-motivation is really key. Some people seem to be natural self-starters, but other people might need a system to keep them to hold themselves accountable, essentially. And ironically, that's also sort of what I describe in my book is a system where you sort of a very simple system where you can hold yourself accountable. But I also just want to add this one thing. Whatever you write, thoughts don't happen in a vacuum. I mean, your thoughts are yours, and in that sense, they're unique, but they also occur in a time and a context. So that means, I have this horror story about a friend who was writing a novel. It's still unpublished. He's been writing on this novel for 12 years. And you know what? It's sort of like it ties in with the Lord of the Rings, that whole wave when that started about 15 years ago, I guess. So it's in that theme, and he even had a publisher reaching out to him who was interested in publishing it. But he's just such a perfectionist that he never managed to finish the book. And now that wave is sort of over. So, yeah, so work. Just do it right now.
Well, and the thing with that, too, is I think a lot of people suffer from imposter syndrome. They think everything needs to be perfect, and it doesn't. Two of the things I always talk about with my clients is, one, is don't be afraid to take the plunge. But the main thing is that done is better than perfect. Just get it out there.
Yeah, there is no such thing as perfect.
Absolutely. But what do you feel is the hardest part about getting published?
Again, it depends on the individual situation. Do you write fiction or nonfiction, or is it for a mass audience, all that stuff. But I would say deciding on which route to take. So I had a feeling that my first book wouldn't be a New York Times bestseller. So that sort of eliminated some of the choices. I'm sure most people that start writing something, they also do a little Googling, and then they quickly learn that being taken on by one of the big publishers, that's really a feat, and you can't count on that happening. So for me, the hardest part was really just I was doing everything myself because I chose to self-publish on Amazon. And in retrospect, I did hire a proofreader, a professional proofreader, but in retrospect, I would have not done everything myself. I think you should do what you're good at, in this case writing. Don't waste your time offsetting or proofreading, or even proofreading the proofreader and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, you have to run it like a CEO, right? You trust people to do their jobs. The editors, formatters, book cover designers, let them have one job, let them stick to it.
Exactly, yeah.
Well, let's talk about marketing. So please share a marketing strategy that you have used in your book launch that has worked well.
So I wish I could, but I can't. But I can share a strategy that didn't work. So I just want to stress that this book was really born out of, I have a friend who is also a businessman and a sort of intellectual. So we usually meet up, let's call it twice a month, and talk. And one day we were talking about writing. Turns out we'd both been writing. I've been writing since I was 15. He's been writing since he was 18. Just like a good 25 years ago, probably. And then I realized, it just dawned on me, dude, you haven't you haven't finished a book. You got to do that. You're approaching 40. Now is the time to do that. So I really just decided I'm going to write a book in 10 days. That's the decision I took. I mean, the point I'm arriving at here is I wrote this book for me, really just to prove that I could, and knowing that I could will make it easier to write the next one. So I didn't spend a whole lot of time on marketing. I ran social media. I still do. I run a podcast of my own. But I had a pretty big YouTube channel, and I promoted my book on there. But because there's a misalignment between the topic of that YouTube channel and the topic of my book, I sold, let's call it 2 copies, even though I shared the knowledge of the book with, let's call it 100,000 people maybe. So that didn't work.
Well, let me ask you about this, because you brought up something I found very interesting, and that is that you wrote a book in 10 days. So walk us through that journey and how you were able to accomplish that, because that's a very impressive thing to be able to get a book done that quickly.
Right. So this comes with a disclaimer. It ended up taking me probably all in all 16 or 17 days, but that was with the proofreading and everything else. But I wrote, so I probably wrote like 90% of the book in 10 days. Well, it was really just about the decision. I made the decision, and I mean, I guess that's the whole key. It was sort of a realization I had, I guess, about 7 or 8 years ago. I used to work in social psychiatry, and many of my clients, the people I mentored, were like young adults with financial issues, psychological issues, sometimes drug issues as well. And a huge problem for all these people, a common denominator, I guess, was that the complete inability to self-start and self-motivate and to stay the course, so to speak. So I spent a lot of time working on that. So when I really promise myself that I'm going to do something, I follow through with it. So that was really, I mean, again, this refers back to this whole realization that I've been dreaming of becoming a published author, or just I've been calling myself an author, at least in my own mind, for a good 20 years plus. But I hadn't finished a book. So that was what motivated me. I made a promise to myself, and I just did it.
So did you go ahead and map out the book, and did you work on 1 chapter a day? What was your strategy?
I did map out the book, which was also the main difference from other books I've been working on. Now, I did also find that nonfiction, for some reason, is a little easier, at least for me personally. It seems easier to map out. But having a structure, I used to not care about that at all, but that doesn't work. You do need a structure,
Yep.
at least some type of, let's call it a work template or something like that. But I didn't want to, because I think we're going to return to that in just a few minutes probably, but I didn't want to force myself to work on a specific chapter. To me, the important part was just, I know this is the basic structure. We're going to have these 3 main chapters. If I'm inspired to write on chapter 2 Wednesday, that's what I'm going to do. If I'm inspired to write on chapter 3, that's what I'm going to do. So I didn't follow it. I mean, yeah, I think that answers your question probably.
Well, I mean, and I love that you did that, because that's one of the formats that I've done myself and I recommend to our clients is, if you're not inspired by writing chapter 1 right now, don't write it. Write the chapter that you are the most hyped up and excited about, that you're most passionate about, and write that chapter first, because what's going to happen is that's going to spill over to your other chapters. And I'm sure you had that as well, where you were fired up about writing, a certain chapter, but then what happened is that spilled over to the other chapters as you were progressing with the book.
Yeah, I can certainly relate to that. Yeah.
So were you going after 1 chapter a day, or were you just writing when the inspiration hit? What was your strategy with that?
I mean, I really don't struggle with inspiration for writing. So I just sat down and I wrote and I wrote and I wrote, and I worked 14-hour work days.
And so you did that over 10 days, 14 hours a day for 10 days to get it done?
Yeah, yeah.
And you wrote it, right? Or did you write it out? Or did you speak it out?
No, I wrote it. I wrote it.
Excellent. Yeah, I'm old school that way. My 15 of my books are all done where I just typed them in Word. Although my newest book, which is about virtual summits, we actually based that off a series of podcast episodes we did, took the content, turned it into text, and then we added a little bit of storytelling and some cleaning up with that. And that's how we turned into our 16th book. But the thing is, there's no perfect method. It's just got to be what you're comfortable doing. And it sounds like that's how you're comfortable doing it. Working on it every day for 10 days, getting the base of it done, and then having your editor and formatter clean it up from that point.
Right. I mean, I would love to hear your perspective on this. Actually, let's say you decided that your next book would be your opus magni, right? It would be like your life, your legacy. I may choose a different structure for a book like that. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
It really has to be what you're comfortable with. So with virtual summits, I didn't really feel like doing a whole book on it. So that's why I felt it's a good idea to do a series of 10 solo casts, which is what we did. So episode 490 through 499 of our podcast were actually based on that. So that was my inspiration, is to get that book out there because it was a very niche thing. Now, with my first book, which was about my own journey about struggling with weight, Eat Less and Move More, I was really fired up about that because it was the first book. You're never going to be as fired up about a book, with the exception of your first one. When you're doing your second, your third, your fourth, you're still getting the creativity out and you're still speaking on those topics, because we've done books about personal development, about wellness, about motivation, but then we've also done books about how to write a book or how to get your book published for your business or doing a podcast or a summit. So everything's a little different. But definitely the first book, I feel that really is your opus. That is the one where you want to have the biggest bang for the buck. And I think that's why most of our people are so inspired to get that first book out there. And you're still inspired for the second, third, even your 16th book, but it's nothing like getting that first book out there. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think I know what you mean. Even though I don't share the sentiment on an emotional level regarding my own first book.
Yeah.
But you are nonetheless inspiring me right now. I may just call my second book my first book.
Hey, there you go.
Title.
Well, and speaking of books, I'd like to know, what is your favorite book and what was the number one thing that you learned from it?
That's a really tough question. I can't answer this question without just giving a few honorable mentions here. So I read *Sapiens*, Yuval Harari, a few years back. That was really a great read. In fiction, there's a Danish author. I happen to be Danish originally, called Johannes V. Jensen, *The Fall of the King*. That's probably my favorite fiction book. But in terms of impact, I'm going to go with *Thinking Fast and Slow*, Daniel Kahneman. That's it's really about how people think and rationalize and that kind of stuff. And the number one, I think the book found me just the right time and place probably. And the number one takeaway for me is that many of the things that we take for granted as intuitively obvious are actually not true. And that really led me down a path of self-exploration, essentially. Great read.
And for a final question, what is your favorite quote and why?
I'm always tempted when people ask me for quotes to say, "Get to the chopper," or some other Schwarzenegger quote. But one quote that's actually been haunting me, and ironically, it has to do with writing, is Scott Fitzgerald. And he wrote, "You don't write because you want to say something. You write because you have something to say." And I think this translates into many aspects and spheres of life. Don't do it because you want to be seen or heard, but do it because you actually have something that you want to share with the world, that you even need to share with the world.
Well said. Well, Asger, I want to thank you for being a guest on the show. What is the best way for people to find you online?
I would say my podcast, which is called MetaQuest, META Quest. It's about science and self-exploration and philosophy. You can find that on YouTube or just Google it.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank you once again for being on the show, and I wish you all the best in your author journey ahead.
Thanks for having me, Paul. It was a treat.
Thanks again for joining us today. To learn more about how to get your book published with a proven system that works, grab a free copy of my book at getpublishedpodcast.com.